Trevor and Ken were hunters. They'd go hunting together for animals, rabbits or foxes. In the year 2000, Trevor Moody and Ken Jones were lamping at the foot of the Wicklow Mountains. Lamping is basically hunting at night, using bright lights to stun the animals. Generally used for rabbits or foxes, as was the case on this night. But on this night, Ken and Larry would encounter a scene neither would ever forget. They could see a parked vehicle, they could make out some movement, but it was difficult to make out exactly what was happening in the nightlight, so they got out of their jeep and made their way on foot towards the vehicle. Something didn't feel right. Earlier that same day, Friday, February the 11th, Larry Murphy was also hunting, but not for animals. He was in Carlow Town where he had spotted his prey, his chosen victim. He stalked her, watching her, lying in wait. This 28-year-old woman, who we'll call Grace, had seen this man loitering, watching her, giving her the creeps. She had finished work around 8 p.m. She loaded the day's takings into her handbag, as this wasn't just Grace's place of work, this was her business. She made her way to her car, which was parked in a nearby public car park, unlocked the door and began to open it. Conscious of the dark figure hiding around 20 feet away in the shadows close to a streetlight. This was the moment Larry Murphy attacked. Larry Murphy is a well-known name to most people in Ireland. Most people will remember the day Larry Murphy was convicted, sent to prison for his horrific crime. Although professionals at the time believed this was not the first time he did this to someone. So were there more victims? We're going to look at who Larry Murphy was before, during and after the one crime he has been convicted of, because a lot has happened before this and since his conviction too. I need to issue a severe content warning. This is not an easy case to listen to. I'll be discussing violent offences and I will at times be going into details which are necessary for the context. So if you think you may be affected by listening, please do not. Be self-aware, do what you need to do. If you can't listen to this one, I'll see you in the next one. Everything I talk about here is already out there somewhere, on the internet, in books, in documentaries or media articles. I've just gathered it all together. This is the case of Larry Murphy. I'm Louise. Welcome back to A Drop in the Ocean, guys, and let's dive in. Larry Murphy was born on February 7th, 1965, making him now 59 years old. He was raised in Stratford-on-Slaney, County Wicklow, with a population at the time of approximately 150. He had 6 siblings, 5 sisters and 1 brother. His brother Thomas would say, when he was growing up he was never any trouble, butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. Larry went to primary school in County Wicklow and secondary school in Baltinglass until he was 14 years old, when he left school and worked in the construction trade. Larry went on to become a master carpenter, specialising in spiral staircases. His father had been a carpenter also. In the carpentry circles, Larry was known as having a temper. One man, called Ken, was aware of Larry through his carpentry. He knew Larry as having a temper, someone you wouldn't question or try to haggle a price with. Ken would later come across Larry Murphy again, and we'll get to that. Larry was into football and socialising. He would socialise, go to pubs drinking, but on his own, he was a bit of a loner, and he'd cause trouble. He had a reputation for making women feel uncomfortable by saying inappropriate things to them, commenting on how he didn't approve of their makeup or what they were wearing, and staring at women. There's also an account of him groping a girl, sexually assaulting her in a pub at the foot of the Wicklow Mountains, the Donnard Arms. Larry knew people in this pub, and they knew him, but he did this in front of everyone, which is quite telling about the kind of personality we're dealing with here. It obviously didn't bother him what people thought of him. We heard about this assault from a man called Trevor. Trevor, who along with Ken, came across a horrific scene at the foot of the Wicklow Mountains while hunting. Larry had been pointed out to Trevor by his friend, the woman that Larry had groped in the pub. Some of her male friends she was socialising with that night had to intervene, pulling Larry off of this woman and getting into a row with him over this. And this was not uncommon. This assault took place in 1996. It was never reported to law enforcement. This was 1 year following Jojo Dullard's disappearance. Last confirmed sighting in Moon, County Kildare, possibly sighted in Castledermot. And 2 years before Deirdre Jacob disappeared. Last sighting outside her home in Newbridge, County Kildare. Larry Murphy had never been in trouble with law enforcement. But as we'll discuss, that wasn't because he didn't do anything wrong. It's simply because he was never reported, so he stayed under the radar. Fast forward to the year 2000. 4 years later. Friday, February 11th. Location, Carlow Town. Larry Murphy is on the hunt. He was known as a seasoned hunter, proficient. He generally hunted pheasants. He was using these skills again on this day, waiting, watching, stalking, and then attacking in a public car park right in Carlow Town. As Grace opened her car door, Larry pounced. He hit her so forcibly into the face that he fractured her nose, sending her back into the car with another punch. An attack which would last for hours had begun. Larry Murphy put this woman through hell, a horrific, unprovoked, senseless ordeal. He physically assaulted her right there in a public car park, ordering her to remove her shoes so she couldn't run away, and then her bra, which he used to tie her hands together, ordering her into the passenger seat and then forcing her to crouch into the footwell. These details are very important, so remember them. Before driving her car across to his car, forcibly moving her to the boot of his car, which he had parked discreetly in another area of that same car park. Larry drove 9 miles to Beaconstown, just north of Carlow, County Kildare. A 10-minute drive from Moon, Jojo Dullard's last confirmed sighting. Half an hour from Deirdre Jacob's. A place Larry knew well. He made one stop at a bungalow on his way to Beaconstown to pay a man he owed money to, a subcontractor, leaving the stereo blaring, of course, in the car, which also, by the way, contained a child's car seat and children's toys. So this man didn't hear Grace screaming. Even if this man had looked into the car with the obvious signs of children, it's unlikely he would have suspected a partially dressed, bloody woman tied up in the boot. This predator had planned well. He knew what he was doing. Was this his first? It didn't seem so, at least not to detectives and inspectors in hindsight. On reaching Beaconstown, Larry pulled Grace from the boot onto the rough terrain where she could see they were in a very remote area. Here, he brutally, sexually assaulted her, before again driving again with Grace in the boot, and this time 22 kilometres to Spinnan's Cross at the foot of the Wicklow Mountains. Less than 20 minutes from Moon, Jojo's location, and 40 minutes from Deirdre's. This was Larry's own hunting ground. Larry Murphy was known among the hunters in this area, a good seasoned hunter with his own personal hunter's hide built into a nearby tree where he could watch his prey. Around 5 kilometres away from his own house, where his wife was waiting for him to come home, and 2 young children were likely in bed, completely oblivious to the horrific ordeal their father and her husband was at the moment putting Grace through. I'm not going to go into any more detail here than necessary to let you know what this monster did and what his MO was. Here, Larry ordered Grace into the front of the car where she could see the child's car seat and toys. Larry Murphy again raped Grace. He horrifically violated her, chatting at her between each horrific assault, telling Grace where he was from, Baltinglass. He ordered her back into the boot. She continued to fight back. He had pulled a plastic bag over her head which he had retrieved from the front of the car and attempted to smother her with it. But having freed one hand, she got to remove the bag, and then he began strangling her with her bra, having stuffed the plastic bag into her mouth. At this point, Grace was left in no doubt. She knew her fate. He had told her his name, Michael, a lie, but he had also told her where he was from and what his 2 young sons' names were. Identifiable information. Somehow Grace wrestled her way out of the boot during this struggle, and then a blinding light. Everything suddenly stopped. As Trevor and Ken got closer, it became evident what they were seeing was a struggle, a man and a woman. They had seen the woman's legs sticking out of the boot. Now the man had jumped back into his car and the woman was crawling on her hands and knees, bleeding, trying to get away from this man, this vehicle, a Fiat Punto. This woman was obviously beaten, with blood everywhere, and she was partially unclothed. She crawled from the vehicle on her hands and knees into a fence of barbed wire, just as the driver of the car jumped back in and sped away. Both Ken and Trevor instantly recognised Larry Murphy. If Trevor and Ken had not stumbled upon this scene, Grace would be yet another missing woman in Ireland. After calming petrified Grace and ensuring her they were not going to hurt her, they helped untangle her from the barbed wire. They put a jacket around her and they took her to Baltinglass Garda Station, where they reported Larry Murphy was the man who had done this. In the Garda Station, Grace had to make a statement to ensure Larry was held accountable. She couldn't even wash tonight, as she would need to be forensically examined. It would be hours before this part of the ordeal was completed. But she knew she couldn't allow this to happen to anyone else. In this moment, Grace, a victim of an unspeakable assault, became the survivor of Larry Murphy's brutal attack. She triumphed over the unimaginable ordeal and thwarted his attempt on her life. Grace's strength and survival stand as a testament to her courage in the face of unspeakable horrors. Is it possible others were not so lucky? Having fled the scene as quickly as possible, Larry went for a drink. He bought a bottle of whiskey from the bar, the Stratford Arms, which had been his local when he was growing up, perhaps to figure out what he should do next. She had escaped, gotten away, and he had told her so much about himself. So what now? Ultimately, he went home, with the stench of whiskey on his breath which he had been slugging on the drive, just in time to go to bed with his wife, Margaret, his unsuspecting, pregnant wife, while his sons, 2 and 4 years old, were obliviously asleep in their beds. Law enforcement were outside Larry's house for the whole night, ensuring he didn't flee anywhere. They arrested him first thing the following morning. The only response they could get from Larry at the time was, "I flipped." And then he wouldn't speak without his solicitor present. Larry Murphy was charged with false imprisonment, assault, 4 counts of rape, attempted murder. Initially, he was proclaiming his innocence. Larry claimed that in the second location he brought his victim to, everything was consensual, and that he never tried to murder her. He said, "I had sex with her, but that was her own choice. We made love in the car. I didn't try to kill her at all. I had sex in 2 places with her, but the second time was her own choice." When asked did he realise the trauma he had inflicted, how his attack had affected this woman and probably would for the rest of her life, Larry's response was, "She's alive, isn't she?" At the last minute, on the day Larry was up in court, with Grace present at Naas District Court, to the surprise even of his defence team, he pleaded guilty to each of the charges. He knew they had all the evidence they needed for this one. This was 15 months later, and Larry Murphy would plead guilty to the rape and attempted murder of a woman in the Wicklow Mountains, and was sentenced by Judge Paul Carney to 15 years in prison, with an additional 4 years for the assault, 3 for robbery, to run concurrently. The judge suspended the final year of each sentence because of Larry's guilty plea. This guilty plea effectively ended Larry Murphy's marriage. His wife Margaret had continued to visit Larry while he was proclaiming his innocence, but cut contact once he admitted guilt, and to date he has never met his son, born following his arrest. His guilty plea would at least mean Grace would not have to be put through a trial, but courageously she did submit a victim impact statement. More evidence of Larry's hidden side had come to light since his arrest. Multiple women contacted Baltinglass Garda Station with stories of being stalked by Larry, being groped by Larry. He had rear-ended the car a woman was driving, having followed her, trying to force her off the road. They were telling of his behaviour in the local pubs with his inappropriate comments, staring at women inappropriately, and a woman came in to tell them of something which had happened a few years prior in 1996. This woman was a friend of Larry's wife. She had been visiting them in their home in Castledermot at the time, and Larry offered to drive her home. On the way, he veered off the road into a laneway. He stopped the car and tried to make a move on her, make a pass at her. She refused him, pushing him away, and this angered him. He shoved her into the seat with his hands around her throat. The woman said his face changed in that moment. She didn't recognise him, and he scared her. It was a side of him she had never seen before. She managed to open the door and scramble out of the car and began to run towards the main road. He caught up with her, grabbing her from behind. But he began pleading with her not to tell his wife. That look he'd had in his eyes was gone. He looked normal again. So eventually she agreed to get back into the car, returning to the house, where Larry's wife unexpectedly came back asking what happened as the woman was crying. Larry told his wife what had happened. He just admitted to it, and no more came of it. Larry Murphy would be confined to Arbour Hill Prison to do his time. Here, he was among some of Ireland's most vile convicts, including Frank McCann, who burned his wife and foster child to death, and David Lawlor, the first person in Ireland to be convicted using DNA, and who also, while his wife was pregnant, raped and murdered a woman as she made her way home from a Christmas party, and who went to primary school with Larry, was friends with Larry, was cousins with Larry. And Rory O Connor, who held 2 women in an apartment at knife point and took turns raping them. Larry Murphy was right at home here, it would appear, as this was where he would finally speak about some things he had done. There was another inmate there too from the Midlands who has remained unnamed, who contacted the authorities with information regarding Larry Murphy. This is something that can happen in any prison. Inmates constantly in each other's company and often becoming friends can learn details never known before. They'll talk to each other, brag, giving away specifics about crimes they have committed that they would never confess to on the outside. But this can be used as leverage to make a deal. You see, if an inmate should happen to have information that they are aware is worth a lot to law enforcement, they can offer to divulge this information to receive something in return, a reduction in their sentence, or to aid in them getting released early on good behaviour, get some time shaved off. It's a system, and it can work. One of the problems with this system is that it can result in inmates coming forward with information that simply isn't true, just so they can make a deal, get out earlier. The Irish police were made aware of an inmate who had information and who wanted to speak with them regarding Larry Murphy and details of what he allegedly admitted to when among his prison mates. They questioned this inmate in 2006. They would question him more than once over a decade and found his statements never changed. He told them Larry Murphy had said the Irish police didn't have a clue that there were more bodies up in the mountains and they wouldn't find any DNA because he didn't leave any. During an altercation with another inmate, Larry also claimed to have killed, saying, "I've killed 2," or "I've killed 2." It's unknown whether Larry was saying he has killed 2 people or that he has also killed. These statements, however, could not be verified. The detectives interviewed the other men who were said to be present when these statements were made, but they wouldn't talk. The statements reportedly made by Larry Murphy during his incarceration would be corroborated by a second inmate who came forward later. When the second inmate contacted law enforcement and met with Detective Inspector Alan Bailey, who is now retired, who had served as the national coordinator for the Special Garda Task Force for Operation Trace set up in 1998, a specialist team set to look at 6 of the missing women at the time in Ireland, although there were many more. The inmate told Detective Alan Bailey one night in prison, while Larry Murphy and his new buddies were drinking prison vodka, Larry began to brag. He told his fellow inmate he was driving out of Newbridge town one day and spotted a young woman standing at the side of the road. He pulled over, using a map he had in his car, pretending he wanted directions. Deirdre Jacob leaned in through the passenger side to help him. He punched her in the face, startling her, and pulled her in through the passenger side. He forced her down into the passenger side footwell using a hammer he had in his car as she was fighting back. He began to drive, but while travelling, Deirdre didn't stop fighting back and screaming, so using the hammer, he murdered her. He then drove her across to the Blessington Lake area and disposed of her body. So is this statement made by the inmate to be believed? Well, this particular inmate who came forward, he was serving a life sentence for murder. He had been in a physical altercation with a man, and during this altercation, the man fell and hit his head, I believe, and died as a result. This inmate held his hands up to this crime, taking full responsibility and saying he didn't want anything in return for his information, saying he deserved his sentence, he was where he deserved to be. He knew he had nothing to gain. He couldn't actually be released on good behaviour. But he said he had a daughter himself. And that is why he wanted the Irish police to know what happened to Deirdre Jacob and her parents and family to get some closure. Do you remember in the previous episode when we were discussing Deirdre Jacob and the witnesses who came forward? One of these witnesses was a man who was driving a Jeep with an elevated view. This man didn't come forward until 2019, but when he did, he said he had seen a car on Deirdre Jacob's road that day around the time Deirdre went missing, and it caught his attention because there was a person in the passenger side down in the footwell and was either laughing or crying. He couldn't tell which. And do you remember earlier how I told you Larry, having overpowered Grace in the public car park in Carlow Town, had forced her into the passenger side footwell while he drove her car across the car park to his own car? This fitted his MO. The term modus operandi, it's a Latin term and it describes an individual or group's habitual way of operating, which represents a discernible pattern. Larry also reportedly gave his fellow inmates some very helpful information for them of some great hiding places if they ever needed to hide a body around the Wicklow Mountains. So the Operation Trace team began looking into this mounting circumstantial evidence and also felt Larry Murphy fitted the type of person they were looking for. When an investigation like this takes place, there will often be a criminal profile established. What this means is the criminal profile process is defined by the FBI as a technique used to identify the perpetrator of a violent crime by identifying the personality and behavioural characteristics of the offender based upon the analysis of the crime committed. So this helps them try to identify the type of person who could have committed these crimes. In this case, the disappeared women of the Vanishing Triangle. They were focused on Annie McCarrick, Jojo Dullard and Deirdre Jacob. However, when looking into Larry Murphy's MO, another unsolved murder came up in their system. All focus on these disappearing women had begun with Annie McCarrick's disappearance in 1993. Antoinette Smith, mother of two, disappeared in 1987 while making her way home from a David Bowie concert. She was last seen in Dublin City. Her body was found 9 months later in the Dublin Wicklow Mountains. There was a plastic bag over her head and her hands were tied together with her bra. Her footwear was missing. The last sighting of her was when she joined two men who were looking for a taxi to Rathfarnham. The taxi man verified this, saying Antoinette, the person he believed to be Antoinette, didn't know the two men and he was nervous on the journey as one of the men started joking about robbing his car, but he didn't feel they were really joking. This was around 4 a.m. They were dropped to the Yellow House pub in Rathfarnham, not far from where Antoinette's body was found. Unfortunately, evidence from this crime scene has been lost, so it doesn't seem the case will be reopened. Detectives brought files to the UK to have the CCTV footage from Deirdre Jacob's case analysed and enhanced. They believed they discovered a man standing in or outside the post office while Deirdre was there that could have been Larry Murphy. They showed the enhanced footage to people who knew Larry. Some people did not identify the captured image as Larry Murphy. Others said it could be him. It was also established Larry Murphy, carpenter, had done some work in Deirdre Jacob's grandmother's shop in Newbridge Town. Remember, Deirdre had visited her grandmother on the day she disappeared? This information only became known following the death of Deirdre's grandmother, as they found Larry Murphy's name scribbled on a piece of paper, leading them to discover he had carried out some work there. However, it couldn't be established whether or not Larry had been in Newbridge on that precise day. The area mentioned to the team by the inmate was searched, including with the use of sub-aqua teams for a lake in the area, the Blessington Lake. But no trace of Deirdre Jacob was ever found. They had no hard evidence. Larry Murphy wouldn't speak to them. He is reported to have said to them, when they attempted to question him, "Do you have a body?" They said no. Well then, F off. So when law enforcement got all of this information regarding Larry Murphy's prison confessions, they realised that he had actually been identified as a possible suspect at the time of Jojo Dullard's disappearance. The local sergeant had named Larry Murphy, knowing him as a nuisance to women in the area and that he had violent tendencies towards them. Then they also came to realise Larry and his wife were living in Castledermot at the time of Jojo's disappearance, and witnesses had claimed to see Jojo in Castledermot that night after the time she made the phone call from the phone box in Moon, a short distance away. Then the detectives looked at vehicles, trying to establish if Larry Murphy was driving a red car, as multiple witnesses that night, the night Jojo disappeared, had reported seeing red cars, including the taxi driver who had seen the car on the Waterford Road, where the woman ran from the car in bare feet, remember? This was included in Larry's MO. They couldn't establish if Larry was driving a red car, but they did find out he scrapped a perfectly good car in December of that year, colour unknown. Jojo disappeared in November. There were 2 men involved in the case of Antoinette Smith. There were 2 men involved in the sighting by the taxi driver the night Jojo disappeared. One man was relieving himself outside of the car, and a second man followed the barefooted woman who ran from the car. Did Larry have an accomplice? Let's look for a moment at David Lawlor, the first person in Ireland to be convicted using DNA, and who, also while his wife was pregnant, raped and murdered Marilyn Wren as she made her way home from a Christmas party, and who went to primary school with Larry Murphy and was Larry's cousin. This crime David Lawlor was convicted of took place the same month Larry Murphy illegally disposed of a perfectly good car, colour unknown. 1 month following Jojo Dullard's disappearance, David Lawlor was convicted in 1998 and sentenced to life in prison. Could Larry Murphy and David Lawlor have been the 2 men seen by the taxi driver on the Waterford Road where the woman ran from the car in bare feet the night Jojo Dullard disappeared? And or have been the 2 men possibly seen with Antoinette Smith getting in the taxi to Rathfarnham back in 1987? Operation Trace found eerie similarities between Larry Murphy and his friend and cousin Lawlor. They had socialised and worked together. Both were married with children. Both had successful careers in which they were skilled. Both had kept under the radar, were not known to the police. Both were living double lives. Both had pregnant wives when the crimes they were convicted of were carried out. But again, there is no hard evidence. In relation to Deirdre Jacob's case, with all the new information law enforcement had, they truly believed they had enough evidence, although circumstantial, to get Larry Murphy. So a file was prepared and sent to the DPP, but the DPP responded with "do not prosecute," finding insufficient evidence to secure a prosecution. There was lots of circumstantial evidence, but no hard evidence. Larry Murphy has not been convicted of any other crime. He could not be ruled out in regards to Jojo Dullard or Deirdre Jacob, so remains to be a suspect. They also couldn't rule him out of Annie McCarrick's disappearance, although this was before they came to the realisation that her sighting in Johnny Fox's pub was probably a case of mistaken identity, and before they realised that someone known to her had assaulted her before her disappearance. But they still couldn't rule Larry out. But even circumstantial evidence doesn't seem to exist to linking Larry Murphy with Annie McCarrick's case, whereas it does both with Jojo Dullard and Deirdre Jacob. Larry Murphy never showed any signs of remorse for the crime he pled guilty and was convicted of. He never said he was sorry or gave any logical explanation for what he'd done, because there isn't one. For sex offenders in prison, there is help offered, psychological help. Sex offenders programs, which is great. Having carried out such a heinous crime, they don't just take away your liberty, your freedom. They offer you help to assist rehabilitation, to help ensure you're not in danger of reoffending, to protect the public. The file that was prepared for the DPP on Larry Murphy as chief suspect in the disappearance of Deirdre Jacob included a psychologist's report. This report suggests Larry Murphy had psychopathic personality disorder. He could go on to commit further crimes. He's at high risk of reoffending. Now, this evaluation had to be done from a distance, through observation, as Larry wouldn't engage with any of the help offered. Through observing Larry, they also said he was quiet and controlled, but then could go into a rage. The risk of reoffending was high. Larry Murphy refused treatment of any description while in prison. He was released on 12th of August 2010, having served only 10.5 years of his 15-year sentence. The reason for his early release? He was a model prisoner. Even though he wouldn't accept any treatment to help prevent reoffending, he didn't have to. Larry Murphy is not on Ireland's sex offenders list. He's not registered as a sex offender, as the Act only came into effect in 2001, 1 month after Larry Murphy's sentencing. Law enforcement tried questioning him before his release regarding other missing women they suspected him of being involved with, but he refused to engage at all. Larry Murphy walked out of prison greeted by no one. He got in a taxi and drove away. The village of Baltinglass, where Larry Murphy was from, made it perfectly clear he was not welcome and was not to come back. Larry's own brother, Thomas, publicly disowned him, saying he had tried to get answers from Larry, but all Larry would say was, "I flipped." And then also with Larry refusing any sort of treatment in prison, Thomas no longer wanted anything to do with him.
I'm curious to know, what would it take for you to sit down across a table and have a pint, have a conversation with your brother?
I wouldn't.
Under any circumstances?
Under any circumstances, sit down with him. Because I sat looking across the prison desk at him. I couldn't get answers.
What if he told you he wants to give you the answers?
Well, if he wanted to give me the answers, he would have given them to me in Arbour Hill. He's not going to give them to me at this stage. I had to find it out for myself. He wasn't man enough to sit behind that desk and answer straight questions when he was asked them. And I don't think he's the man to answer them now. He hadn't even the manners this morning, or the decency, when he come outside that prison gate, to say sorry to the poor girl.
Do you love him as a brother?
No. I want nothing to do with him ever again. And I'm on public television saying it. I want nothing to do with him. I don't want to see him, and I don't want to hear from him.
Ireland was in uproar with his release. Fear gripped the nation. Larry remained hidden for a while, but realising he was going to be followed everywhere he went in Ireland, he fled to France, then on to Amsterdam, then Barcelona in Spain. Authorities are always updated roughly with his whereabouts. He had to return to Ireland in 2011 for a new passport, as his previous one had been robbed by a prostitute. He left again for Paris, and then Holland.
Week's shocking revelations on midweek that one of Ireland's biggest sex offenders was living in the city and hanging around with another convicted Irish sex offender changed all that.
This man here, seen with Larry Murphy, was none other than Rory O Connor, who had been in prison with Larry Murphy, who had held 2 women in an apartment at knife point and took turns raping them. He was released in 2008, having served 6 years of a 10-year sentence. During the time in the Dutch capital, the pair worked and socialised together and shared a scooter as means of transport. They both worked in a logistics company and lived in the Wester Park area. By 2018, Rory O Connor was in Edinburgh in a relationship with a woman called Diane Nicholl. Diane's sister, Gail Atkinson, had found out about Rory's past online and confronted Rory in front of Diane. Diane was devastated, but Rory convinced her he had been wrongfully accused, that it was a threesome gone wrong, and she believed him. Diane's sister Gail informed law enforcement about Rory's past and his relationship with her sister, and Rory's risk level was upgraded to violent offender after Diane was seen sporting a black eye. In August 2021, Rory O Connor would murder his fiancée Diane Nicholl, having beaten her, resulting in car crash injuries. This happened even with monthly checks on Rory by law enforcement. He's currently again imprisoned, serving a sentence of at least 15 years and 6 months before he is due for parole. Larry Murphy moved from Holland to London, England. Although he has moved house a few times to avoid media and publicity, which he will probably need to do for the rest of his life, he has remained in London. In 2023, Larry Murphy changed his name by deed poll. He is now going by Charlie Doyle, spelled Charley. Spelt this way for a male is of German origin, meaning free man. He is still in the construction trade and is said to be in a long-term relationship with a businesswoman who is well aware of his past. Changing his name from Larry Murphy to Charlie Doyle doesn't change his title of Beast of Baltinglass, a title he won that fateful night in the year 2000. And it doesn't change that he is still a suspect in the disappearance of Jojo Dullard and Deirdre Jacob, or Antoinette Smith. When Antoinette Smith was sexually assaulted and murdered, Larry Murphy was 22 years old. If Larry Murphy is in fact a psychopath, research suggests psychopathic traits often first show themselves during adolescence, in particular at the age 14 to 15, the age Larry Murphy left school. Was Antoinette Larry's first kill? On November 12th, 2023, a documentary called 6 Silent Killings, Ireland's Vanishing Triangle was aired on Sky Documentaries and Now TV. This documentary exposed a hidden underground chamber close to Larry Murphy's home and final destination with his victim in the year 2000. In the making of this documentary, 2 cadaver dogs, Springer Spaniel Nellie and Border Collie Bee, were brought to this area on separate occasions, so one dog at a time, and both alerted for human remains in the exact same place. Following this documentary's release, on the 23rd of December, this area was searched, with the Independent reporting Gardaí investigating Ireland's missing women have carried out an unsuccessful search of a wooded site on the Wicklow-Kildare border after a trained cadaver dog detected what might be human remains. It is understood the search was conducted last weekend by a team of Gardaí with specialist search equipment. They are understood to have ruled out the presence of human remains at the site. It's unknown if there will or will not be further searches carried out here. I can't find anything more on it, but you would hope there will be a lot more work done in an area where there is an underground chamber located in the area of a convicted criminal and suspect regarding missing women. It is a place that fully needs to be explored, so hopefully we will be hearing a lot more about this, and of course I will update you with any and all further investigations. Frank McCann, who was one of Larry Murphy's prison buddies, has been recently in the media again. He had been convicted of 2 life sentences for setting his house on fire in Rathfarnham and fleeing the scene, while his wife and foster child remained inside. In recent years, Frank McCann was regularly on unsupervised release from prison a few days a week for work placement. In November 2023, he had applied for temporary release. This would mean from 1 night to 6 nights release. His victim's family were shocked at the news and frightened. Frank McCann is another criminal who has shown no remorse. He also becomes enraged when his name comes up in the media, as it could affect his parole. Every 3 years, his victim's family have to write letters to the parole board to try keep him locked up, as they believe he is a danger to society. It is said he made several attempts on his wife's life beforehand to prevent her from finding out he had fathered a child with a teenager, before succeeding in December 1992 not only in taking his wife Esther's life, but also baby Jessica's. It is said he had kissed baby Jessica, placed her back in her cot, lit the house fire using a gas cylinder, and left. There was another monster at large too. John Crerar, a father of 5, convicted 2 decades after another heinous crime through advancements in DNA testing, and who is reportedly grappling with a severe lung disease as he awaits his end of life. According to an insider quoted by the Irish Sunday Mirror, the convicted murderer, known for his lack of remorse, has abandoned social interactions with fellow inmates and work activities due to his deteriorating health. Crerar, who resided in close proximity to Phyllis Murphy's family in Kildare town, was implicated in the crime after DNA testing placed him at the scene of Phyllis's brutal murder. Her lifeless body subjected to a vicious attack involving assault, rape and strangulation was discovered in a secluded area near the Wicklow Gap in January 1980. Initially armed with another rock-solid alibi, Crerar's claims were refuted 20 years later when a withdrawal of the alibi occurred. The source emphasised he remains devoid of remorse, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge responsibility for his actions, making it unlikely for him to be granted temporary release. Similar to serial killer John Shaw, Crerar is expected to spend the remainder of his days behind bars. In the aftermath of Phyllis Murphy's disappearance, a massive search effort involving 3,000 volunteers, civil defence, army personnel and police was initiated. During door-to-door inquiries, Gardaí took note of suspicions surrounding Crerar, describing him as shifty and nervous. Despite initially receiving an alibi from a colleague claiming Crerar was at the security hut at the Black & Decker plant in Newbridge where he worked, County Kildare, on the night of the murder, a breakthrough emerged in 1997. Paddy Bulger, a co-worker, disclosed to authorities that Crerar had arrived late for work on that fateful night and had washed out the trunk of his car on site. Phyllis Murphy's inquest revealed a harrowing struggle for survival, marked by over 30 injuries. In a poignant statement last year, Phyllis's sister Barbara Turner expressed strong opposition to Crerar's potential release, deeming him very unwelcome in Kildare town. The case of Larry Murphy still sends fear through many people. Larry Murphy was convicted of one crime, and that was the horrific assault and attempted murder of one woman who he abducted from a public car park in Carlow and eventually took to the Wicklow Mountains, where he planned to and attempted to end her life. He wasn't convicted or charged with any other crime. Larry Murphy was married with 2 small boys and a baby on the way when he did this. It shows us we don't always know who we are living with, married to, sharing our bed with. We don't always know who our brother is, who our father is. What we do know is where Larry Murphy is now, and I don't think that will change because the media follows him everywhere he goes. The authorities will always be aware of his whereabouts, so at least there is that. And he is on the sex offenders register in England. He was initially rated as a high risk of reoffending, and that has been reduced to medium risk. But we have more important people to talk about now. Grace. Not her real name. She won. And although I'm sure Grace really doesn't like when Larry Murphy yet again pops up in the media or on the television or in another YouTube video about her horrible ordeal, Grace's story is a very important one. Sources say Grace did more than survive. She went back to work. She got married. Grace shows victims all over the world that you really can survive and find happiness after something horrible, something unspeakable happens to you. And even if these sources are incorrect, she survived. People who are in a situation where they feel there's no light at the end of the tunnel, if Grace could survive, there's hope for you too. I know if someone close to me was missing, the last person I would like to think had anything to do with that was Larry Murphy. Unfortunately, wanting that to be the case doesn't mean it is. The families of the disappeared women of Ireland say they want their stories told to keep their loved one's story public, in the hopes of bringing their daughter, sister, niece, cousin, aunt home. But it still must be so difficult to see or hear everything all over again. It really can't be easy, and my thoughts are with the families of all of our missing people. I hope you get the answers you need and that you bring your loved ones home. To you, the viewers, subscribers, thank you for coming on this journey. It hasn't been an easy one, but it's certainly worth it. I hope this series can help keep these cases current, and just maybe someone will finally decide to come forward with that crucial piece of information that is so desperately needed. Thank you all so much. Take care of yourselves. Good luck and goodbye.